It seems like every former NBA player and a couple of active players having podcasts is the new norm in today's society. I hate being that guy, but Paul George gets more podcast episodes in these days than games played. Okay, I'm joking. I know he's injury prone, and honestly, I think his podcast is great. But since podcasts seem to be the new way for athletes, it's my mission to make the official all-podcast NBA team. Keep in mind that this is going to be a mix of how good that player was or is in the NBA, and of course, we have to factor in their podcast itself. So if you're a good player but your podcast sucks, there's a chance you don't make the list, and of course vice versa. We're going to be adding everything to the lineup, even coaches and bench players, so make sure to stay tuned. We have to start our team with a point guard because they're the guy who will lead the squad and communicate to the rest of the team. So let's go take a look at our candidates. Patrick Beverley has always been a dog on the court, and when we found out he'd be on a podcast, it was clear what would happen. He would obviously create fireworks, calling out players and coaches alike while giving us insight into the game of basketball. His co-host is Roan from Barstool, and since Beverley has been added to the Barstool universe, it's honestly been electric. Sadly, he doesn't get our starting spot since he wasn't exactly a star on the court, but he might make an appearance on the bench, so stay tuned. Another point guard with a podcast is Trae Young, and in my opinion, he's one of the most underrated players in the NBA. But since his podcast hasn't gotten that much attention, I gotta leave him off the squad. There's also Austin Rivers, whose podcast has been getting some traction as of late, but honestly, it's not overly popular, and in the NBA, he wasn't an all-star. So who can we possibly choose for the starting point guard spot with a dope podcast? The clear answer for our point guard has to be Jeff Teague. Teague is literally one of the best NBA storytellers I've heard because he's not afraid to make fun of himself and others. He has awesome co-hosts, and his clips are all over social media going viral. While it's true he wasn't a superstar in the NBA, he has an all-star nod, and he was a solid point guard for years. So for the all-podcast NBA team we're building, he gets the spot. Now we need to find a backcourt partner for Teague, and we could go with one of the guys we mentioned above. But instead, I'm gonna go in a different direction and move Paul George in the 2 and start him at our shooting guard. We talked about him in the intro, but honestly, we gotta go into detail for why we picked him. PG has one of the most popular NBA player podcasts out there, if not the most popular. He constantly gets insane guests that have a bunch to say about basketball, and if you watched him since he started, you would know about all the funny moments, like when DeMar DeRozan was talking about Damian Lillard and low-key dissed George on his own podcast, or his former Clippers teammates telling Kawhi Leonard stories and showing how funny he truly is. And then on the court, there's not much to say because we all know how good Paul George is. He struggled this season with staying on the court, and when he does play, he's having a tough time getting into rhythm. But there's a reason Brandon Miller said that he was his basketball GOAT. PG is one of the smoothest players ever, and his accolades speak for themselves. He's made 9 All-Star teams and 6 All-NBA teams, so in addition to his great podcast, he's also a killer on the court. Hopefully he can get healthy and keep giving us timeless basketball moments. At the small forward spot, we have a couple guys to choose from, so let's list them. Kevin Durant has a podcast, and if you've heard him talk about hoops, it's absolutely amazing. And obviously he has the basketball pedigree to make the list. He's one of the best players in NBA history. And honestly, he might be the best unicorn we've ever seen. But since his pod doesn't have too many episodes and honestly hasn't gained much traction, he's gonna be left off the list. So the next guy we're gonna choose is a player who's had a number of controversial moments since retiring from the game of basketball. And that's Paul Pierce, one of the greatest Celtics of all time and players in general. If you're familiar with his podcast, you know that he's only one half of a duo, but we'll get into that later in the video. For now, we gotta talk about how hilarious Pierce is because every time he's given a mic, he's saying something crazy. Do you remember the moment when he was wheelchaired off the court in the middle of a game only to come back in the fourth quarter? Well, on various TV networks and his podcast, Pierce has said a bunch of different things. One being that he had to use the bathroom, and another being that he was actually injured. Let us know what you believe actually happened in the comments below because I'm gonna say he had to go number 2. Either way, I brought that moment up because it shows how hilarious Pierce is with a mic in his hand. Of course, he was also a great basketball player too, with 10 All-Star appearances, a championship in 2008, and a multitude of clutch shots. So he's gonna start at our 3. I don't even want to mention anyone else for power forward because there's only one guy who can take the spot, and that's Draymond Green. I think we always knew Draymond would make something like this because on the court, he has a lot to say. So it makes sense that off the court, he has even more to say. Jokes aside, it's actually a really good podcast with great basketball knowledge, and it has commentary on the state of the NBA and honestly the world. He always has great guests, and at the end of the day, Draymond is an entertainer and a basketball player. Oh, and he also won 4 championships with the Golden State Warriors while solidifying himself as one of the best defenders ever. He has a Defensive Player of the Year award and is widely respected as one of the most versatile defenders ever, so shout out to Draymond. I hope Jusuf Nurkic and Rudy Gobert aren't watching this video because they may get mad we're giving Draymond his flowers. To round out our starting 5, this one is really tough, but for a different reason than you may think. We're gonna give the nod to Shaquille O'Neal because come on, it's the Diesel. But I really wanted to run a small ball 5 and put Kevin Garnett here because him and Paul Pierce are a dynamic duo that creates amazing moments together. Sadly, we're pushing KG to the bench as our 6th man, so let's focus on our starting center. Shaq is the definition of an entertaining player because during his time in the NBA and in retirement, he's been in movies, commercials, on TV, and a bunch more. Shaq's been the DJ at huge parties, and now he has a big podcast, no pun intended. And in this podcast, podcast, he gets to talk about anything and everything. He's talked about Dwight Howard on there, the state of the NBA, and of course he's brought in a bunch of noteworthy guests. When it comes to being a podcaster, I'm not gonna lie, him and Garnett are a toss-up, which is why we have to look at playing career. And that's an easy choice, because even though KG was awesome, Shaq is literally the most dominant player ever, and he won a bunch of stuff in his career. He led the Lakers to a bunch of championships and then won in Miami with Dwayne Wade, while also racking up accolades such as MVP, 15 All-Star nods, and a Rookie of the Year. So when it comes to anyone against Shaq from an entertaining perspective, unfortunately, they're barbecue chicken. Now that we have the all-podcast starting 5, it's time to start talking about our reserve. And even though there are a bunch of players we could choose from, we're gonna limit it to 5. Our 6th man is of course Garnett, who we just talked about, and if you have the time, please go watch the Pearson Garnett pod. While other NBA player pods are filled with mainly interviews and commentary about stuff outside of actual basketball, these two talk about the current NBA and they're funny. Don't get me wrong, they have some old head takes, but at the end of the day, they're great on the mic. KG has an MVP and a DPOY along with a bunch of All-Stars and the title as a top 3 trash talker ever, so of course he gets the spot on the bench. The next bench spot we have is going to be taken by a controversial NBA player who was great but had some questionable moments in the NBA. Gilbert Arenas is a very outspoken individual when it comes to basketball and honestly anything, so of course his podcast is awesome. He goes from talking about going toe-to-toe with LeBron James in the playoffs to guessing the NBA player in a Jesser video. So he really goes anywhere in the entertainment world. He gets heated when he has guests on and his reactions go viral on every social platform there is. And then on the court, Arenas was a demon. He was a 3-time All-Star and honestly I think he could have had a couple more if some stuff didn't go down. Anyway, in 2005 he averaged 30 points a game, which proves to you how good of a basketball player he really is. Scoring 30 points in an NBA game has to be one of the toughest things to do, and if you do that for a full season, you're legit. Shout out to Arenas, man, keep making good content. Next up, we have another duo that I couldn't leave off the team, and both of these guys were good NBA players. So honestly, I think our squad is looking nice. Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson might have some of the best interviews in sports media, and I'm not joking, which is why they have to be on the list. I've seen websites say they're some of the pioneers for sports podcasting as we see today, and I fully agree. What's different about their platform is that they don't care at all what people say, so whenever they have guests on or if they're talking, they say what they want unfiltered. They started this thing years ago, and even though some of the others have taken over in popularity, they changed the game for NBA podcasts. They have a great Kobe Bryant interview where they talked about a bunch of different things, and they've just had a variety of interesting people on their pod. When it comes to actually playing basketball, Matt Barnes was a solid role player for a bunch of years for a lot of different teams. I mainly remember him in a Clippers uniform with the Lob City Clippers and being teammates with a guy we're gonna bring up in a minute, but overall Jackson was better. They both weren't All-Stars, but Jackson had a couple of seasons where he averaged over 20 points a game, and a bunch more where he was around 17 points per game. He helped teams win, and honestly, I think he's underappreciated when talking about scores in NBA history. Our final bench piece for this team is a guy who under normal circumstances should be starting and the #1 option, but since he's a bit inconsistent with it and never had his own yet, we're gonna make him our 10th man and our secret weapon. Don't be mad, but it's LeBron James. Now look, I know he isn't a podcaster or whatever, but him and JJ Redick filmed a couple of episodes and they were amazing. LeBron gave some in-depth stories about his career, and honestly, I think he's a guy that everyone wants to hear from when it comes to basketball. He's the smartest player ever, and his knowledge is on a different level. I know this seems sort of unfair, and honestly, it kinda is, but this is all for fun, so don't be too mad. The all-podcast team can't put a team on the court without a coach, and based on what I just said, I bet you can guess who it is. Before JJ Redick was the head coach of the Los Angeles Lakers, his podcast was one of the best out there. And I don't mean just in sports, because they were drawing in viewers from everywhere. Redick would showcase a ton of basketball knowledge, but he also made sure to tone it down at times. And he would also talk about other fun things like golf, social commentary, and my personal favorite, random drafts of random things. He also conducted some amazing interviews, which made the pod that much better. He's one of the best college basketball players ever, and during his time in the NBA, he was a sniper ready for any shot to come his way. Even though Redick's coaching career isn't picture perfect, he clearly knows the game, and the Lakers aren't that bad, so he gets the spot pretty easily. And that's officially the all-podcast team when it comes to NBA players. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and as always, click on the screen for more basketball content.